In 1980, the Rank organization closed the last dedicated Bush radio factories in Britain. 6 years later, the name was sold to Alba, stripped of its engineering heritage and reduced to a licensing badge stamped onto imported supermarket electronics. The domestic production lines fell silent. The high street radio dealers lost the sets they had recommended for generations. A brand built on absolute domestic trust became a private label, competing purely on price in a retail environment that no longer valued longevity. A few decades earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Bush was not merely a manufacturer, it was the definitive architect of the British kitchen and sitting room. The Bush badge on a tuning dial was a promise of reception, warmth, and resilience. But the real story of Bush Radio is not only the story of a famous name sold to an importer. It is the story of a British wireless empire that shaped the post-war listening habit, only to be dismantled by the very retail and technological forces it once dominated. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that shaped how Britain heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters. The story begins not with nostalgia, but in Shepherd's Bush, London, in 1932. In 1932, the British sitting room was undergoing a quiet transformation. The BBC had just moved into its purpose-built headquarters at Broadcasting House in London, formalizing its role as the definitive voice of the nation. The national program and regional program were expanding their reach, sending news, music, and spoken word into the ether. Yet, for many households, the physical act of receiving those voices remained a technical and financial challenge. Before 1932, early British radio was often the domain of the hobbyist or the wealthy. Listeners relied on cumbersome battery sets, which required heavy, acid-filled glass accumulators that had to be carried to the local cycle shop for weekly recharging. The alternative was a mains radio, a receiver that plugged directly into the household electrical supply, but early examples were often expensive, visually imposing wooden boxes that looked more like laboratory equipment than domestic furniture. The British public did not just need a radio receiver, they needed an appliance that looked as though it belonged beside the fireplace. The gap in the market was not identified by a traditional engineering firm, but by the entertainment industry. The Gaumont British Picture Corporation, a titan of the British cinema and film production world, recognized that the future of home entertainment lay in the wireless set. To capture this emerging audience, they established a subsidiary to manufacture receivers that could deliver cinematic clarity of sound into the domestic space. They set up their first manufacturing facility in Woodger Road, in the West London district of Shepherd's Bush. Taking its name from the local area, Bush Radio Limited was born. The early Bush receivers were valve radios, devices that used glowing glass electronic valves to amplify weak broadcast signals pulled from the air before the invention of the transistor. These were substantial, heavy machines. Inside their cabinets sat a large metal chassis, carrying transformers, glass valves that ran hot to the touch, and a sizable loudspeaker, the moving paper cone that physically pushed air to turn electrical impulses into audible sound. Bush did not invent the valve circuit, nor did they pioneer the loudspeaker. Their genius lay in standardization and presentation. They understood that a radio had to be a piece of furniture first, and a technical instrument second. It had to look reassuring. When early Bush models appeared on the market, they were priced as major investments. A typical mid-1930s mains receiver could cost upwards of 12 to 14 guineas. At a time when a skilled factory worker might earn £3 a week, a Bush radio represented a month's wages. It was a purchase families saved for, discussed, and eventually placed in the center of the sitting room with a sense of ceremony. Because of this high cost, Bush made a strategic decision that would define their reputation for the next 4 decades. They did not sell their radios to just anyone. They established the Bush-appointed dealer network. A listener could not buy a Bush set from a mail-order catalog or a generic department store counter. They had to visit a designated high-street electrical shop that had been thoroughly vetted by the manufacturer. These dealers were required to maintain a dedicated repair bench in the back room and employ a qualified service engineer. If a tuning dial, the illuminated glass scale showing the station frequencies, became misaligned, or if a valve burned out, the local dealer was contractually obligated to fix it. This was not merely a sales tactic. It was a structural moat. By controlling the service network, Bush ensured that the customer's relationship with the brand was mediated by a trusted local expert. The high street radio shop became the physical anchor for the brand. The Bush logo on a shop awning meant that the radios inside were guaranteed to work and guaranteed to be repaired if they failed. Demand for these reliable, well-supported radios quickly outgrew the original Woodger Road site. By 1936, just 4 years after their founding, Bush Radio relocated to a much larger, purpose-built factory on Power Road in Chiswick. Here, hundreds of workers on structured assembly lines soldered components, aligned circuits, and fitted cabinets. The sheer scale of the Power Road operation transformed Bush from a cinema spin-off into one of the most formidable manufacturing empires in the British consumer electronics sector. The physical interface of a Bush radio was designed to be handled not by an engineer, but by a housewife, a returning worker, or a child tuning in to Children's Hour. The medium wave and long wave bands, the frequency ranges used to carry domestic and international broadcasts across vast distances, were clearly marked with station names like Droitwich, Hilversum, and Radio Normandy. But the true test of the British radio infrastructure was about to arrive. In September 1939, domestic radio production came to an abrupt halt. The Chiswick factory, along with the rest of the British electronics industry, was requisitioned for the war effort. Bush pivoted to manufacturing military communications equipment. Yet, the radios they had already built and sold became more important than ever. Throughout the blackout, families gathered around the glowing dials of their pre-war Bush receivers to listen to the BBC Home Service. The radio was the only immediate link to the outside world. During those 6 years of conflict, the wireless set proved its absolute necessity. When peacetime returned, the British public emerged with an insatiable appetite for new radios. And Bush, having survived the war with its manufacturing capabilities intact and its reputation forged in the high street repair shops, was perfectly positioned to define the next era of domestic listening. When the Second World War ended, the British domestic landscape was fundamentally altered. Rationing remained strict, new furniture was heavily restricted by the utility scheme, and housing was in desperately short supply. Yet, amidst the austerity, the appetite for broadcasting had never been greater. The BBC had reorganized its networks, launching the Light program to provide entertainment and music alongside the trusted home service. Listeners wanted to hear these new voices, but they needed a machine that fit into the constrained reality of a post-war home. Bush Radio responded not with a massive piece of wooden furniture, but with a masterclass in domestic engineering. In 1946, they released the DAC 90, followed in 1950 by its refined, definitive successor, the Bush DAC 90A. This was a table radio, a compact receiver designed to sit neatly on a sideboard, a mantelpiece, or a small table, rather than dominating the room. It was not the first small radio, but it was arguably the most perfectly judged. The breakthrough began with the cabinet. Rather than using expensive timber veneers, Bush housed the DAC 90A in a shell of Bakelite, an early, hard synthetic plastic that was strong, moldable, and visually striking. The designers gave it a soft, sloping profile with rounded edges and an integrated carrying recess at the back. It was available in a dark, mottled walnut brown or a more expensive, brilliant cream. It looked modern, yet immediately comforting. Inside the Bakelite shell, the engineering was a triumph of pragmatic British design. The DAC 90A was an AC/DC mains radio, a receiver that plugged directly into the household electrical supply. Crucially, the AC/DC circuit design meant it did not require a massive, heavy, and expensive internal mains transformer. Instead, its valves, the glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before the transistor era, were wired in series. When the radio was switched on, these valves glowed warmly, casting a soft amber light through the ventilation slots at the rear, while producing a faint, familiar smell of warm dust and heated plastic that became synonymous with British domestic listening. But its greatest technical triumph was its independence. Older radios required a long, cumbersome wire strung across the sitting room or out of a window into the garden to pick up a signal. The DAC 90A featured a built-in frame aerial. A coil of wire wound around the inside of the cabinet that received radio waves directly from the air. A listener could simply carry the radio from the kitchen to the sitting room, plug it into the wall, switch it on, and immediately hear the BBC. This combination of form and function did not come cheap. In 1950, a Bush DAC 90A cost around £15, a figure inflated by the heavy post-war purchase tax. At a time when the average national weekly wage hovered around £7, buying this radio required a commitment. It was a significant household investment, often bought on a hire purchase agreement. Because it was expensive, the method of selling it became the bedrock of the Bush empire. You could not find a DAC 90A in a generic mail-order catalog or on the shelf of a discount warehouse. It was distributed exclusively through the Bush-appointed dealer network. These were independent high-street electrical shops, carefully selected by Bush representatives. The radio shop in the 1950s was a place of local authority. In the front window, the radios were displayed like jewelry. In the back room, there was always a repair bench. If a capacitor, a small internal component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, eventually dried out, or if the fabric grill, the woven cloth covering the opening through which sound leaves the cabinet, became damaged, the customer carried the radio back to the high street. The local service engineer, armed with a soldering iron and an official Bush service manual, would repair it. This infrastructure created an impenetrable moat around the brand. Practical Wireless. A magazine read religiously by radio hobbyists and repairmen, praised Bush circuits for their logical layout and ease of servicing. The engineers trusted the chassis. The dealers trusted the margin. The listeners trusted the dealer. When a family sat down to listen to the Archers on the Light program, or gathered for the evening news, the physical experience of operating the DAC 90A reinforced that trust. The user interacted with a large, clear tuning dial, the illuminated glass scale that showed which station the radio was tuned to. This dial was not just a list of numbers. It was a map of Europe. It bore names like Hilversum, Luxembourg, Droitwich, and Athlone, promising voices from across the continent, captured and pulled into the British sitting room. The sound was delivered through a high-quality Celestian loudspeaker, the part of the radio that physically pushes air to turn electrical impulses into audible sound. Despite the radio's small size, the tone was rich, warm, and remarkably clear, cutting through the background hiss of the medium wave. The standard broadcast band historically used for domestic and regional radio services. By the mid-1950s, the Bush DAX 90A had become the standard visual shorthand for the wireless in Britain. It sat in hundreds of thousands of homes, operating flawlessly year after year. It was the perfect synthesis of Southend Plastics, Chiswick Assembly, High Street Retail, and BBC Broadcasting. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the late 1950s, Bush Radio had transcended its origins as a cinema subsidiary. It was no longer simply manufacturing consumer electronics. It was engineering the rhythm of the British domestic day. The DAXI 90A had conquered the sitting room, anchoring families to the evening broadcasts of the BBC Home Service. But the way Britain listened was fundamentally changing. The rigid, stationary listening habits of the war years were giving way to a more fluid, mobile lifestyle. Listeners wanted voices in the kitchen, music in the garden, and cricket commentary in the workshop. They needed a radio that could move. The catalyst for this shift was the transistor, a tiny semiconductor device that could control and amplify electrical signals without the intense heat, fragility, and high-voltage requirements of a traditional glass valve. A transistor radio, a portable receiver built around these new components, could run for months on a single battery, making it entirely independent of the domestic main supply. However, the early transistor sets imported from America and Japan were often tiny, pocket-sized novelties. While marvels of miniaturization, they frequently suffered from thin, tinny audio. Bush recognized that the British market did not just want a novelty gadget, it wanted portability without sacrificing the warmth, authority, and presence of a high-street sitting room receiver. In 1959, Bush answered this demand with a machine that would become the defining shape of British mid-century audio, the Bush TR-82. Designed by the industrial designer David Ogle, the TR-82 was a visual masterpiece that bridged the gap between post-war austerity and 1960s modernity. It was housed in a large, circular-edged plastic cabinet, typically finished in a striking combination of dark blue-green and cream, accented by a gleaming brass trim. The front was dominated by a large, transparent tuning dial, the clear, circular scale that allowed the listener to visually navigate the airwaves. Above the dial sat a row of piano key push buttons to switch smoothly between the long wave and medium wave bands. Crucially, it featured a sturdy, integrated carrying handle that invited the user to pick it up. Inside, the engineering represented a leap into modern mass production. The TR-82 utilized a printed circuit board, a flat board carrying all the electronic components, connected by etched copper tracks rather than laboriously hand-soldered wires. It relied on a large internal ferret rod aerial, a highly directional magnetic rod hidden inside the cabinet that pulled broadcast signals from the air, allowing the radio to perform brilliantly without an external wire trailing across the floor. It was powered by a heavy rectangular PP9 battery, a standard format that could be easily bought from any local hardware shop or newsagent. This was not a cheap throwaway item. At its launch in 1959, the TR-82 cost around 22 guineas, roughly equivalent to a month's wages for a junior clerk. Despite the new technology, Bush refused to abandon its proven retail strategy. The TR-82 was not sold in supermarkets or via generic mail-order catalogs. It was distributed strictly through the vetted Bush-appointed dealer network. The high-street electrical shops of towns like Croydon, Birmingham, and Glasgow proudly placed the TR-82 in their front windows. If the plastic handle cracked or the tuning dial mechanism gathered dust, The local service engineer in the back room was still there to fix it. This high-street presence, combined with the sheer manufacturing muscle of Bush, allowed the radio to saturate the country. To keep up with the soaring demand for these new transistor portables and their television sets, Bush had expanded far beyond Chiswick. They opened a massive, state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in Ernesettle, Plymouth, alongside another major plant at Kew. Here, thousands of British workers turned out radios by the lorry load. The TR-82 quickly became ubiquitous. It was the physical embodiment of a changing Britain. This was not just a radio. It was a companion that moved with the rhythm of the household, resting on the formica surface of a British kitchen, pulling the light program through the hiss of the medium wave while the kettle boiled. It was carried to the beach at Blackpool. It was placed on picnic blankets in the home counties. It was balanced on the dashboards of Ford Anglias to hear two-way family favorites. It defined the portable radio, a receiver robust enough to survive daily domestic transit, yet powerful enough to deliver clear, room-filling sound through a high-quality Celestion loudspeaker. For an entire generation of British listeners, the distinctive shape of the Bush TR-82 was simply what radio looked like. It was the absolute peak of the company's influence, but this dominance was about to face a structural threat it could not engineer its way out of. The sheer volume of production required to satisfy this new, mobile listening habit transformed Bush from a successful electronics maker into a national institution. At the Ernesettle factory in Plymouth, the assembly lines operated with relentless efficiency, turning out TR-82s alongside television sets to feed an insatiable high-street demand. By the early 1960s, Bush was not just selling a product. They were provisioning the British public with the primary tool for participating in a cultural revolution. The timing of this portable breakthrough was perfectly aligned with a seismic shift in British broadcasting. While older generations still gathered around the glowing valves of a wooden mains radio in the sitting room to hear the home service, a younger generation was claiming the airwaves for themselves. The transistor radio was their vehicle. Under the bedsheets in suburban bedrooms or gathered on park benches in provincial towns, teenagers used the precise tuning dial of the Bush TR-82 to hunt for Radio Luxembourg, fading in and out through the static of the medium wave under the cover of darkness. By 1964, they were tuning the same dials to catch the illicit signals of offshore pirate stations like Radio Caroline, anchored just outside British territorial waters. When the BBC finally responded in 1967 by launching Radio 1 to serve this new youth culture, the TR-82 was already sitting on millions of bedside tables, ready to receive it. Yet, despite its adoption by the youth, the TR-82 remained fundamentally a family machine. It was universally accepted. It was just as likely to be found on a workbench in a Yorkshire garage, covered in a fine layer of sawdust, playing the cricket commentary on Test Match Special, as it was to be found in a pristine Surrey kitchen. It had achieved what very few industrial designs ever manage: absolute classless ubiquity. This ubiquity was maintained by the iron grip of the Bush-appointed dealer network. The high-street electrical shops in places like Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, and Oxford did not merely stock the radio, they championed it. The dealer knew that selling a Bush TR-82 meant selling a reliable machine that would rarely bounce back with a fault, ensuring their own local reputation remained untarnished. If a customer walked into a shop asking for a radio that would last, the salesman pointed to the brass trim and blue-green plastic of the TR-82. At its absolute peak, the name Bush was synonymous with domestic reliability. The brand had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from the heavy, immobile valve sets of the 1940s to the lightweight, battery-powered transistor era without losing an ounce of its high-street prestige. They had proved that British engineering could embrace new, miniaturized components without sacrificing the room-filling sound and sturdy construction that British listeners demanded. The Bush TR-82, sitting on a Formica kitchen worktop in the mid-1960s, was not merely a plastic box of printed circuits and batteries. It was the definitive agreement between British manufacturing, high street retail trust, and domestic routine. Millions of British households trusted the badge on the front. They trusted the shop that sold it. They trusted the factory in Plymouth that built it. But this delicate ecosystem, balancing domestic labor costs, high street margins, and local repairability, was entirely dependent on a market that respected longevity over outright cheapness. When that market logic began to fracture, the sheer scale of the Bush empire would not be enough to protect it. The dominance of the Bush TR-82 and the vast manufacturing output of the Plymouth and Kew factories projected an image of absolute permanence. By the mid-1960s, Bush was an undisputed titan of the British high street. But this empire was built on an economic equation that was already becoming violently unstable. The success of Bush relied on a precise balance: affordable domestic labor, a loyal and exclusive high street retail network, and a consumer willing to pay a premium for longevity and local repairability. When the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, every single pillar of that equation began to buckle. The decline of Bush radio was not caused by a sudden loss of engineering talent. It was the result of a brutal collision with the structural forces of global electronics. The first massive fracture appeared in the form of foreign competition. For years, the British radio industry had viewed imported transistor radios, the small, battery-powered receivers that used semiconductor devices instead of glass valves, as cheap, tinny novelties. But by the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers like Sony, Sanyo, and National Panasonic were landing highly sophisticated electronics on British docks. These imported sets were no longer toys. They were precision-engineered, exceptionally reliable, styled with sharp, modern lines, and crucially, they were drastically cheaper than a British-made equivalent. Bush found itself caught in the crushing grip of escalating British manufacturing costs. Operating a massive, state-of-the-art factory in Plymouth required a vast wage bill, union negotiations, and immense overheads. Sourcing domestic capacitors, the internal components that store and release electrical energy, alongside British-made loudspeakers and wooden or heavy plastic cabinets, meant the baseline cost of a Bush radio was inherently high. The Japanese factories, conversely, had mastered automated assembly, extreme miniaturization, and aggressive global supply chains on a scale that a purely domestic British company simply could not match. Furthermore, the imported radios introduced a concept that was entirely alien to the British wireless tradition: disposable listening. A Bush radio was designed to be serviced. If it broke, you fixed it. An imported transistor radio was designed to be cheap enough that if it eventually failed, you simply threw it away and bought a new one. This shift in consumer psychology fatally undermined the Bush-appointed dealer network. The traditional high-street radio shop, with its dedicated repair bench in the back room and its knowledgeable service engineer, required healthy profit margins to survive. But the retail landscape was shifting toward discount warehouses, mail-order catalogs, and eventually, supermarket electronics aisles. These new retail environments did not employ service engineers. They did not care about local repair networks. They cared only about volume, turnover, and price. The protective moat of the vetted high street dealer, which Bush had spent 30 years carefully excavating, suddenly became a heavy, restrictive anchor, preventing them from reaching the mass discount market. Recognizing the severe structural threat posed by these combined forces, the rank organization, the corporate parent of Bush, realized the brand could no longer survive as a standalone entity. In 1962, they orchestrated a monumental consolidation of the British electronics industry. Bush Radio was merged with one of its fiercest domestic rivals, Murphy Radio of Welwyn Garden City, to form a new corporate monolith, Rank Bush Murphy. Publicly, the merger was pitched as a patriotic pooling of British engineering resources, a way to build a unified front against the tide of imports. Internally, it was a desperate defensive maneuver to cut overlapping overheads and rationalize production. The psychological impact on the British radio industry was profound. Two of the most distinct, fiercely independent voices in domestic manufacturing had been forced into a marriage of survival. The immediate consequence of this merger was terminal brand dilution. A brand that had once prided itself on bespoke, independent engineering began to surrender its unique identity to the logic of the balance sheet. In the years following the merger, a customer walking into a high-street shop might compare a Bush radio and a Murphy radio, entirely unaware that beneath the plastic casing they were virtually identical machines. They rolled off the same assembly lines in Plymouth, sharing the exact same printed circuit board, the flat platform carrying the connected electronic components, and differing only in the shape of the outer cabinet and the badge glued to the front grille. The Bush name was no longer a strict guarantee of unique, dedicated engineering. It was becoming a marketing choice, applied at the end of a production run to appeal to brand loyalty. As the 1970s progressed, the living room itself changed. The television set completely displaced the radio as the focal point of the evening. Meanwhile, audio reproduction was splitting into two extremes. For serious music listening, the market moved toward expensive, high-fidelity stereo separates. Systems using a distinct amplifier, turntable, and twin speakers. For casual background noise, the market wanted ultra-cheap, disposable portable sets. Bush, a company built on manufacturing high-quality, mid-priced standalone radios for the family sitting room, found itself trapped in a category that the British public was rapidly abandoning. The corporate marriage that created Rank Bush Murphy could not alter the underlying arithmetic of the global electronics trade. By the mid-1970s, the structural forces aligned against domestic radio manufacturing had become insurmountable. The British consumer still wanted a radio in the kitchen and the bedroom, but their expectation of what that object should cost and how long it should last had been entirely rewritten by the import market. The massive Bush manufacturing facility at Ernesettle in Plymouth, once the absolute pride of the British mass production system, was rapidly becoming a financial liability. The cost of domestic labor, union negotiations, and running large-scale physical plants outpaced the retail price the market was willing to accept. The Japanese and Hong Kong electronics firms were not merely using cheaper labor, they were implementing highly automated assembly processes and pioneering the use of the integrated circuit. A complex electronic circuit, miniaturized onto a single small chip of semiconductor material, replacing dozens of individual components. A British-built Bush radio, relying on domestically sourced loudspeakers, bulky tuning mechanisms, and traditional printed circuit boards, simply took too long to assemble and cost too much to build. The company found itself trapped in a fatal squeeze. They could not maintain their traditional engineering standards without pricing themselves off the shop shelf, yet lowering the quality meant destroying the very trust that made the Bush name valuable. Simultaneously, the retail landscape that Bush had relied upon for its survival began to disintegrate. For decades, the Bush-appointed dealer network had been the foundation of the empire. The local high-street shop with its vetted service engineer in the back room was a powerful moat against cheap competition. But in the 1970s, the British high street was transformed by the rise of the discount electrical warehouse, and the laminated pages of the Argos catalog. These new retail giants operated on a fundamentally different philosophy. They did not have glass display windows carefully arranged by a knowledgeable dealer. They did not employ service technicians armed with soldering irons and circuit diagrams. They functioned purely on high-volume, low-margin logistics. If an imported transistor radio failed, the customer did not bring it back to a repair bench. They threw it away and bought a replacement. In this new, disposable consumer culture, the local repairability of a Bush radio, once its greatest selling point, became an irrelevant luxury. Facing collapsing market share and mounting financial losses across its consumer electronics division, the Rank organization made the cold structural decision that domestic manufacturing was no longer viable. The retreat was swift and absolute. In 1980, the fatal blow was finally struck. The Rank organization announced the closure of its television and radio manufacturing plants, including the vast Plymouth factory. Thousands of British workers, many of whom had spent their entire working lives assembling the sets that furnished the nation's sitting rooms, were laid off. The physical infrastructure of the Bush Empire, the injection molding machines, the testing benches, the soldering stations, and the design laboratories, was dismantled, sold, or scrapped. The British production of Bush radios had ceased, but the name itself was deemed too recognizable to completely discard. It entered the purgatory of brand licensing. In 1986, the Bush brand was purchased by Alba, a company specializing in the distribution of low-cost electronics manufactured in the Far East. The badge that had once been a cast-iron guarantee of bespoke British engineering, high street trust, and domestic longevity was stripped of its context. It became a private label sticker applied to generic televisions, cheap cassette players, and clock radios destined for the shelves of supermarkets and discount chains. A customer walking into a shop in the late 1980s might still see the name Bush printed on the front of a plastic casing. But the engineers who designed it had never seen Welwyn Garden City or Shepherd's Bush. The hands that built it were thousands of miles away. The local dealer who would have once repaired it had long since closed his doors. The brand had survived, but the radio company was entirely dead. The high street shop closed. The service manuals were discarded. The Plymouth factory fell silent. The British production lines stopped. The repair bench vanished. The brand name was sold. The badge moved to the supermarket. The dial lost its promise. The imported plastic took its place. A British empire went quiet. Today, the name Bush is one of the most widely recognized electronics brands in the United Kingdom. It is virtually impossible to walk down a British high street or browse a modern retail website without encountering it. Since 2008, the brand has been owned by the Home Retail Group and subsequently by the supermarket giant Sainsbury's, functioning as a proprietary house brand for Argos. If you open an Argos catalog or browse their website today, you will find the Bush badge stamped across an enormous array of household electronics. It appears on budget televisions, cheap sound bars, 15-pound Bluetooth speakers, washing machines, and even kitchen toasters. The name survives with absolute, unquestioned brand awareness. But it is a ghost. The modern iteration of Bush has absolutely zero engineering, historical, or physical connection to the company founded in Shepherd's Bush in 1932. The badge is merely a licensing tool, a familiar arrangement of 4 letters applied to mass-produced, imported white goods and disposable consumer electronics to make them appear less anonymous to the British buyer. The original covenant, the promise of bespoke domestic engineering and vetted high-street repairability, was completely severed decades ago. The physical geography of that original empire has also been erased. The vast Ernesettle factory in Plymouth, which once turned out millions of TR-82s and defined British mass production, was eventually sold to Toshiba before they too abandoned British manufacturing. Today, the site forms part of a mixed-use industrial and distribution estate. The original Woodger Road site in West London and the sprawling Chiswick facility have long since been swallowed by the relentless redevelopment of the capital. The physical infrastructure of a domestic wireless empire has been dismantled brick by brick. Yet, while the corporate entity was hollowed out, the objects they built point-blank refused to die. Across Britain, an entirely different kind of survival is taking place, not on the shelves of supermarkets, but on the wooden repair benches of sheds, garages, and spare bedrooms. In the secondary market, on eBay, Gumtree, and at dedicated events run by the British Vintage Wireless Society, the original Bush valve radios and early transistor radios are passionately hunted, traded, and preserved. For the vintage radio collector, the Bush DAC 90A remains the ultimate rite of passage. Thousands of these Bakelite table radios have been rescued from dusty lofts and charity shops. On weekend afternoons, amateur engineers carefully unbolt the chassis. They painstakingly replace the dried-out wax capacitors, the degraded internal components that must be swapped to prevent catastrophic electrical failure, with modern equivalents. They clean the pins of the glass valves, polish the brown Bakelite cabinets until they gleam like dark glass, and replace the small glowing dial lamps. When that restored DAC 90A is plugged back into the domestic mains and switched on, it does exactly what it was engineered to do in 1950. It warms up, the dial glows softly, and the rich, familiar sound of British broadcasting fills the room. The irony of the Bush legacy is that the design of their early portable radios was so fundamentally perfect that the market eventually demanded its return. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, during a wave of domestic nostalgia, the classic shape of the 1959 Bush TR-82 was officially reissued. Licensed manufacturers reproduced the famous blue and cream plastic casing and the gleaming brass trim, replacing the old printed circuit boards with modern VHF FM and, eventually, DAB internals. Even when the original British engineers were long gone and the high street repair shops had vanished, the silhouette of the TR-82 remained the definitive visual shorthand for what a portable British radio was supposed to look like. These surviving original radios matter today because they represent a fundamentally different relationship with technology. A modern smart speaker, a device that plays audio via a home Wi-Fi connection and voice commands, is miraculously convenient, but it is entirely passive. It requires nothing from the user other than an instruction. An original Bush radio demands participation. The listener must physically interact with the machine. You must turn the tuning dial, feeling the mechanical resistance of the cord and pulleys. You must listen through the atmospheric hiss, the static, and the interference to locate the signal. You are not just receiving a data stream, you are pulling a fragile analog wave out of the air and anchoring it to your sitting room. The machine asks you to meet the broadcast halfway. The story of Bush Radio is the story of how Britain shifted from investing in household companions to consuming disposable electronics. For 3 decades, the company perfectly understood the British domestic space. They built radios that were robust enough to survive the kitchen, elegant enough for the sitting room, and reliable enough to anchor a national listening habit. They did not fail because they forgot how to build good radios. They failed because the British market decided that absolute convenience and the lowest possible price were more important than longevity, high street trust, and local repairability. The public traded the service engineer for the supermarket aisle. Yet, The survival of those early sets proves that the instinct for permanence was never entirely lost. Somewhere in a quiet British sitting room, an original Bush DAC 90A still sits on a polished sideboard, its bakelite cabinet warm to the touch, its glass tuning dial glowing softly in the evening shadows, waiting for a hand to turn the knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next video.